Wonder how much I'm worth.
You're fine.
I'd like to know what their strengths and weaknesses are, because being that they want otherwise they wouldn't be comfortable. I guess I should say somebody's taking all this stuff. You know what I mean? No, I mean, I guess I can say so. Yeah, you can yeah, I know. It's either this and it's like, and then once minimal. Oh, but he got that idea. That's not in there.
Okay, folks, let's come on back together. Let's join up. Let's turn our attention back. I hope folks had a good lunch. I know I did. Thank you. I've got about 90 minutes with you left, so I'd like to use it as well as I can. So let's come on back and get you out of here at a good time and all that kind of stuff. Folks, let's, this slide is kind of a capstone to what we've been talking about. It lays out sort of the purpose and the epistemology of each of these fields. I said each of these fields is really a kind of a different culture. Science, they try to describe or explain the real phenomena in the natural world, so they use systematic experiments and observations. That leads them to write in certain ways and to read in certain ways. History tries to describe and explain past events, and they do that through the analysis of multiple perspectives. Literature tries to describe or explain the aesthetics of text. Frankly, the literature is about words. Literature is about the text themselves, and so that's what they study. It's not texts about the world as much as it is the texts themselves that they get into. And their language is often, their technical language is a language about language. Mathematics is analytical reasoning about abstract ideas. It's pure thought about quantities and proportions and measures. That's why it has to be so exact, because of the nature of what they study and the ways that they study it. And so we've got these differences. There's a new book out. I wish I could tell you the name of it, but I'm sure you can probably find it on these folks' website. It's from ETS, the college testing people, educational testing service, and they've got, I guess it's coming through College Board. They work together. College Board has a new book out, just came out a few weeks ago, about how to prepare kids for college. I believe it's free. I think it's probably on their website. And the reason I'm promoting it is because Cindy and I have a chapter, and I think this is actually based on that chapter. I think you'd find that chapter to be really useful, so you might want to go looking for that. I think it's pretty useful for, actually not just for you guys, but for maybe parents and kids in the district to understand what they're preparing for. But I've said it a few times, but I want to make the case. I've said that this isn't about trying to get you to teach like an English teacher or a reading teacher, that we're not trying to move the ELA standards over to you guys and make you responsible for them. But I'd really like to show you that, how specific that is, how appropriate what I'm saying is. And what I've done, well, first of all, I'm using science in this example. What is it that a science student needs to learn? And I would argue that there are 4 things that they need to learn. One, they need to learn the science content, right? There are particular phenomena that the science department teaches. Just like in the history department, there are particular events that we want kids to know about, or particular documents, or particular historical figures. In the same way in literature, we want, the kids need to know perhaps some particular types of text or particular genre that we want kids to be able to read. And in your various specialties, if you're studying pottery making, there are particular things you want kids to know about making pottery. They're the content. You also want kids to know how in the science case, how science is created. Where does it come from? How is it that somebody decides that masks are a good idea or a bad idea? And it isn't, you check with your committee men, down at the political office, right? You look at certain kinds of research. That's how you make those decisions. So how science is created, and how scientists think, how they approach problems. When I look at the science standards in Michigan, I go, gee, there are a number of standards that are focused specifically on knowing the scientific method and things like that. There's a reason those are there. And I would argue, either as a 4th thing or maybe part of that how scientists think, how scientists read and what they do with text is part of those standards, and should be certainly part of the Michigan standards. And so to make the point that this isn't just, oh yeah, they're just trying to push their stuff on us. If you look at what are the most influential science standards in the country, I didn't look ahead of time to see whether Michigan has these or has just been influenced by them. But there's a set of standards that several states have adopted in science, and that even states that aren't using them have been affected by. They've adopted a lot of them. And those standards list some scientific practices. Practices that they believe scientists need to be able to engage in, and that they want science departments to expose kids to and teach kids about. And those practices were not developed by, say, a bunch of school people or teachers. This very illustrious scientific panel that they put together who came up with these 8 things. So this certainly doesn't come from the reading field. This comes from science and scientists themselves. Scientists ask questions and define problems. They develop and use models. They plan and carry out investigations. They analyze and interpret data. They use mathematical and computational thinking. They construct explanations and design solutions. They engage in argument from evidence. They obtain, evaluate, and communicate information. Science teachers, is there anything crazy there that makes you uncomfortable that shouldn't be on that list? I mean, and they write about these. They don't just give you this dumb list like I have. So here's what I want to do. I've broken these out. I've gone into their discussions and their bulleted points, and I'm going to show you each of these again with the bulleted points this time. And I'm going to bend over backwards to try not to put reading into it. I'm going to show you where reading and writing fit in those things. But you can do some of these things without reading and writing, is the idea. So here's the first one. Scientists have to be able to ask questions and define problems. That means being able to formulate empirically answerable questions. You can ask an empirically answerable question without reading and writing. So I left that one in black. But to do this, you have to establish what's already known in the scientific field. How do you do that? You read the literature it has to be read. That's how scientists find that out. You determine which questions have yet to be satisfactorily answered. How do you do that? You read it. It's central to it. It isn't just a little side thing. Oh, we can use reading there. If you could, you could use reading to help formulate empirical answerable questions, but that's why I didn't mark it. That's what I mean by bending over backwards. You could use it, but you don't have to. And therefore, I don't want to treat it like it's central. Develop and use models. Development of models and simulations to help develop explanations of natural phenomena. Models make it possible to go beyond observations and identify flaws in reasoning. But the gentleman who discovered the structure of DNA did it by building models that were consistent with what we knew about what this was doing and how it was working and so on. But you can build a model without reading. You don't need reading to analyze a model, so I didn't mark any of those. Plan and carry out investigations. You have to identify what's to be recorded. You have to identify independent and dependent variables. You have to collect and record data. Recording data is obviously a kind of a literacy thing. Marking those things down. In fact, you don't even get Western science. You don't get this idea of replicability and so on until you can actually write the information down and share that in some easy way. Until you get the printing press, you don't get real science. You don't get what we consider to be Western science. So, it's kind of central to it. Analyzing and interpreting data, putting data into a form that allows it to be interpreted, tabulation, graphical interpretation, visual analysis, statistical analysis. Literacy is kind of central there. Identification of patterns in data. Those are literacy things, guys. Sorry. Using mathematical and computational thinking. I talked earlier about how important it was to be able to put this information into mathematical form. Those abstract worlds that the mathematicians have invented have turned out to be extremely useful for understanding our natural world. And frankly, you can use that information without literacy. So, that's important. It has to be taught, should be taught, but it doesn't have to involve literacy. Constructing explanations and designing solutions. Constructing a logically coherent explanation of phenomena that incorporate explanations consistent with available evidence. Literacy is all over that one. Doing things like writing up a lab so clearly that the study could be replicated maybe by another class. Wow, that's pretty literacy oriented. Engaging in argument from evidence. You certainly can do the reasoning, but the way that scientists typically defend their explanations through the use of evidence is by synthesizing information from multiple places. So pretty central there. And then this last one, obtaining, evaluating, communicating information. I don't think there's anything but literacy in this one. Science cannot advance if scientists can't communicate their findings clearly and persuasively. A major practice of science is communicating explanations orally and through writing, including graphically. Science requires the ability to derive meaning from scientific texts. So what I'm saying is in every one of these, or in several of these, literacy is essential to recording methods and results of observations and experiments. The texts have to be so explicit and complete that they render an investigation replicable. For Researchers depend upon this written record for determining what's known and unknown. Scientists have to be able to locate authoritative text and be able to access this to make sense of it. Science texts are organized in particular ways, such as the structure of a study. Science texts offer explanations of scientific phenomena, such explanations will often be accompanied by a description of the sources of information. The notion that it doesn't matter, literacy is the English departments, according to these scientists, according to so many of these state standards, they're saying, no, the practices we want you to teach kids, some of them you could use literacy, some of them literacy would be pretty useful, some of them, literacy is the whole point. If you don't teach them the right stuff about that, they can't do science. They won't understand what science is. And it's true, the same thing we could pull out if we had lists like this for any of your fields of study. You'd find there are important things in your field of study that don't depend on literacy, and you'd find that there are important things in your field of study that do. And all I'm suggesting is that you teach both of them and not go around the ones that involve literacy. Because in so many cases, that's what happens. The teacher looks and says, some of my kids are going to struggle with this, so I'm not going to use text. Big mistake. I gave an example earlier in chemistry, and I think it's an apt example. It's one I'm kind of proud of. It shows up these days in a lot of textbooks and stuff. So I want to share a couple more. I think hit some other fields and so on with some of these examples. And I've got one here in literature. And literature is funny because literature belongs to the English department. We're the English teachers. Where are my ELA folks? Welcome to you folks. Happy to have you here. Quite often the ELA people will tell me they don't do disciplinary literacy. Disciplinary literacy is what's supposed to happen in the other classes. But that neglects the fact that historically, in academics, we've long considered literature to be a discipline. It belongs there, and in fact, the standards, the ELA standards, are disciplinary literacy standards. They're about the discipline of reading and interpreting literature. A big part of them are, and should be. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, we're not actually giving kids the kinds of insights that, say, the history teachers are trying to do because of Sam Weinberg's work, or the science people are trying to do because of these new science standards. Because the literature people are going, well, we don't need to do that. We just, we teach literature. But literature is a discipline. You got to start letting kids in on the thinking. So I want to show you an example of the kind of teaching that I would argue for that often doesn't show up because of the way that we approach this. And so I would suggest to you that there's a particular reading ability, text interpretation ability, that is unique or highly specialized to literature, and that's thematic interpretation. We don't have themes in chemistry, ladies. You guys know that. And we don't really have themes in history per se. And we certainly don't have themes in mathematics or in the arts, or theme is really a literary idea, and unfortunately, we require it, we teach it sort of, but we never make it a disciplinary idea. We don't make it an issue about how do people who deal with literature think about this kind of text, and why do they think like that? And so I want to share with you an experience. I'd love to tell you this came out of my research. This came out of my parenting. How many of you have your own kids? Oh, geez, almost everybody. Then you'll understand this story for sure. Now, my kids are grown up now. I'm old. I've been doing this a long time, guys. I've actually been teaching or studying reading now for more than 50 years. I know you were supposed to gasp and go, he looks so young. That didn't happen. I'm very upset. The fact is, my kids are grown up. They got their own kids now. But this came about because Megan, my youngest, and she's my science kid. This is a daughter who, she these days is an engineer. She designs medical equipment, does that kind of work. And she found herself taking a high school literature class when she was about 15 years old for some reason. And one night she came to me at about 9 o'clock with a homework question. Now, parents, how do you feel about 9 p.m. homework questions? Yeah, me, I'm like the same team you were on. Don't like those so much. And she could see it. She knew right away, no, Dad, don't worry, you don't have to do anything. I wanted to watch some TV show, and she wanted this homework question. Well, okay, what's the homework question? Well, it was from the literature class. The teacher had assigned a short story for the kids to read. They were supposed to figure out what the theme of the story was. That was the homework. And then the next day, they were going to write a thematic essay about it. And so, that was the idea. So what Megan told me I would have to do is, I said, Megan, I can't possibly tell you whether you got the theme of the story right because I haven't read the story. She says, you don't have to read it. I thought, that's kind of interesting. What do you mean you don't have to read it? Just tell me if it sounds good. So I said, okay, what's the theme of the story? She says, people do a lot of different things. I said, no, that's not the theme of the story. She said, how do you know? You haven't read it. 15-year-old kids, I'm not lying. It's 10 after 9 and I'm reading the damn story. I know you've never done this. I understand. I'm reading it as fast as I can. I'm trying to skim through it. And I got to tell you, about 20 after 9, 9:25, I can see the theme of this story up in neon lights that are flashing. And I'm mad. And I'm loud. I was able to reach the back of this room earlier. Megan, how does your teacher teach you how to figure out theme? And she said, well, Dad, that's just it. They don't. They tell you what a theme is, and I know what a theme is. And then they have you try to figure out the theme in a story. And when you get it wrong, they tell you what the theme was, and that's supposed to help you next time. But it doesn't, because that story has a different theme. And I just nods, because that was the same way I was taught in high school. So the anger kind of went out of me. I didn't have anything to be mad at her about. I was mad at the English teacher. Now, I was very fortunate in this case, because just contemporaneous to this, I had been given a Christmas present. And the Christmas present was an enrollment in a fiction writing class. And it's quite a well-known fiction writing class in Chicago. A lot of professional writers take it when they decide they want to write the great American novel. And so everybody in this class was there to write the great American novel, and I got a Christmas present. This isn't a class about teaching. This is a class about how do you write. And they taught us how to put a theme into a story. We had to learn to do that. I figured if I knew how to get one in, I could get it back out again. And so I didn't have this. This comes later. But I started asking Megan some questions about the story that she read. I don't know if any of the English teachers, maybe some of the other teachers, have you ever come across a story called Luke Baldwin's Vow? This is an old Morley, I hadn't known it either. It's an old Morley Callahan story. It's a very good story. The teacher made a good choice, I thought. It's a story about a boy who's about 13 or 14 years old, who his parents have died recently, and he's been moved to live with an aunt and uncle who he's never met before for some reason. And they live out on a farm, and the kid is terribly lonely, and he doesn't have any real friends. There's an old dog on the farm that he's kind of befriended, but that's his list of friends. His father has said something very puzzling to the boy just before he died. He said, watch your uncle very closely. I want you to find out what kind of a man to be. And he didn't really know what that meant. And so he was struggling with that. His uncle was a farmer. Maybe his dad thought he should be a farmer. He didn't really quite know what to do with that. This kid was lost. I asked Megan, what's Luke like at the beginning of the story? She could tell you all that stuff. She'd read the story. She could tell you what it said about Luke and how really afraid and anxious he was, and what he was upset about, what he was wondering, how at sea he was. She could also tell you that Luke was a different kind of a kid at the end of the story. that Luke had changed. And she could tell you what changed him. There was a crisis. There was an event. One of the things we learned about writing stories is a story is an event, but it's an important event. It's an event that the world will always be different after. And that's certainly true for Luke. Because I told you what Luke was like at the beginning. Something happens, and what happens is the uncle decides one day that the old dog can't work anymore, but he still eats food, and therefore they don't need him anymore, and they need to put him away. And Luke is, it's my friend. You can't put my friend away. A day or two later, Uncle says to Luke, Luke, I want you to run into town and do an errand for me. Hop on your bike and go into town. Luke starts to call the dog. He says, no, leave the dog here. I want you to do this quickly. Sends the kid off. The kid is suspicious. He circles back. And sure enough, here's the hired man, taking the dog with a rope around his neck, tied to a rock, and throws it in the pond. Oh no. And Luke disobeys, he jumps in, and he saves it, he pulls the dog out, and he kind of runs away. He runs to the next farm, and he asks the farmer if he could hide his dog there for a few days while he tries to figure out what to do. And of course, the farmer wants to know what's going on. And Luke tells him, and the farmer says, yep, that's your uncle. He sure knows the value of $1. He says, Luke, do you want to keep that dog? Luke says, I do. He says, I'll tell you what, would you come and muck my barn out after school in the afternoon? He says, yeah, so I'll pay you $1 a day to do that. He says, now here's what I want you to do. You get back on that bicycle, you ride back, you go right up to your uncle, and you tell him this, and you use these words. You say, Uncle, I have a business proposition for you. And offer to board the dog, offer to pay to keep him. Luke does what he's told. He goes back, he tells his uncle that, and his uncle responds just as positively as the farmer told him he would. His uncle says, you know what, Luke? I'm going to let you do this because it will teach you an important lesson. It will teach you how easy it is to separate a fool from his money. That day, Luke Baldwin makes a vow. He vows to always have $1 in his pocket to protect himself from practical men. Right? The neon sign is going. Luke, at the beginning, is afraid and anxious and uncertain. By the end, he knows why his father wanted to watch the uncle so carefully. Not because he wanted him to be like his uncle, but he wanted him to be revolted by him the same way he was. About 20 to 10, Megan blurted out a perfectly good theme for the story. A theme based on just what scholars tell us on the arc of development of the character. A theme isn't just an idea tied to a story. It's not just a lesson. It's a lesson, perhaps, but it comes from the arc of development of the character. A story is an important event. The characters change. Luke is one boy at the beginning, he's a different boy at the end. Megan could tell you that he was different at the beginning and end. She could tell you how he changed and what had changed him. The question then becomes, is it a good change or a bad change? Would the author want you to try to be like this or to try to avoid being like this? And of course, she saw it as a good change. This kid was smart. He figured out the world in a positive way. Essentially, what I did is taught her the way scholars and literary critics figure out themes. People who don't know much about literature, and I certainly, when I was a student, would put myself in that club. Maybe I'm a little bit wiser about it now than I was as a kid. When I would hear people say things like, maybe there are multiple themes in literature, what I thought they meant was, you might read it and see it one way, and she might read it and see it a different way, and he might read it and see it a third way. That isn't at all what they're talking about. They're talking about the fact that in some complex stories and plays and novels, There's not just one character who has an arc of development. There might be multiple characters with arcs of development. In some cases, they might have opposing themes. And you have to read it and say, which one is the author sympathetic to? And which one is, that they're maybe putting their thumb on the scale to make sure that I'll like that one better than the other one. There's a famous study done many years ago by Joanne Golden and John Guthrie, where they looked at theme with high school students and high school teachers. And here's what they found. They intentionally gave the students a Jessamine West article to read, story to read, that had two important characters, a girl and her younger sister. And what they found was that when it came to deciding what the story meant, what the theme was, the kids would, in some cases, pick the older sister, in some cases, pick the younger sister. And the teachers would grade the kids accordingly. So if the teacher thought the main character, the most important one, was the older sister, and you were the kid who picked older sister, you get an A. If I think it's the older sister that matters, and you were most sympathetic and identified with the younger sister, guess what? I mark you down for that kind of thinking. If you look at your standards in Michigan for teaching literature, your kids are supposed to be able to not pull a theme out of text by high school. They're supposed to be able to pull multiple themes out and do things like coordinate those into maybe a larger thematic interpretation. Ooh, but that won't make any sense unless you actually teach them how to make sense of theme, how you figure out multiple themes. It has to be something doable the way that experts do it. Instead, what we do is tell them what it is and hope they can do it. And frankly, some of them can do it with just that little bit of instruction. And those are the kids we go, you would be such a good journalist. You would be such a good English teacher. You could be a playwright. Instead of, I know you're really good at math, but I could teach you. When we think about literature, we use stories to give lessons. Let me show you how some of the complicated ways these guys are doing that. Kind of let them in on the secret. That's what I'm talking about here. So that's kind of a cool technique. One time I'd come up with this and we put this out there. And there have been a lot of studies about trying to teach theme. And they've not done well. People have not found that they could do it. And I remember I was once giving a talk in New York, and right as I was about to go on, the front row filled up with some of those researchers who'd been doing those studies. And I thought, oh, damn, I wish I didn't have this example. And they loved it. They said, that would actually work, because they tried all kinds of other things. This is it. You go out and look at the doctoral level literature on theme. This is the kind of stuff they talk about. Now, they don't talk about Luke Baldwin's vow, but the point is, now, the next day, I missed my TV show. At 10 o'clock, when Megan says he gets the theme, not 10 to 10, whatever. And she says, and I did it all by myself. Yeah, she certainly did. The next day, I was supposed to be doing a workshop for the elementary teachers on teaching some of those more general reading strategies I talked about. And they had in the front of the room, like on the front table is where the napkins and the coffee pot and stuff were, and I was sort of sitting there, and the person was introducing me, and there were a stack of napkins, and I'm writing on the napkins, and that's where this thing came from. I really didn't want to talk about reading strategies. I wanted to talk about this thing that had happened with Megan the night before, because it was actually interesting and different from what people know about. And I'm sketching this thing out, trying to figure out how would you get kids to summarize the story. And so I was boxing this out, and finally the woman says, and so here's Tim Shanahan. And I fold the little paper up and stick it in my pocket. And now I'm tired, of course, because I've been up late with my daughter. And I'm going to present this to the teachers about the strategies and summarization and question and all that stuff. And I get about 10 to 15 minutes into it, and I go, this is really dull. I want to show you something. I pull this little piece of paper out to try to hold it up. Can everybody see the little boxes I've drawn here? Trying to explain it to folks. The fact is, this is very workable, and in your standards, it makes a lot of sense, because if kids are supposed to be able to deal with multiple themes, it's more than just identifying them. It's, can you come come up with a superordinate theme that maybe pulls all those pieces together. If they're opposing each other, can you do things? This makes great sense in a literature class. Doesn't make great sense in a lot of other classes. It's what it is. Let me give a social studies example, again, of something that's in your standards. Unfortunately, this is a 5th grade example, because that's where I developed this one. So it undershoots you just a little bit. This is a 5th grade social studies chapter. I had been invited into a suburban district in the Chicago area to teach some disciplinary literacy to the 5th graders about American history. And I love American history, so I accepted this. The day before, they sent me the chapter. The chapter that they sent me, they faxed it to me, was like 26 pages long. And I couldn't understand it. I don't know if you've ever had this, we say things like that hyperbolically, but I honestly couldn't understand this chapter. I tried to read it, and it didn't make sense. And I'll show it to you. This is the beginning of it. I'll take you through a little bit of it. I couldn't understand it, and I thought, what am I going to do? And I could have done the easy thing. I could have said, you know what? I'm not really going to do disciplinary literacy tomorrow. I'll do continuity reading. And so here's how I'll handle it. I'll go in and I'll tell the kids that good readers ask questions. Good readers, think through the material and they ask themselves a lot of questions and they try to answer the questions. And so today we're going to try to read like good readers. I'm going to have you read part of this chapter, and then you guys are going to come up with the questions, and I'll make sure you get answers to all your questions, and we'll work through the text, and you'll see that if you do that, you remember more of the information. Not a bad thing, not very disciplinary. I did know the research about social studies textbooks in the upper elementary grades in middle school and high school. And what they tell us about history books is that they are terribly incoherent. The pieces don't fit together very well. And because the pieces don't fit together very well, students don't read these books with very high comprehension. There are studies where they literally take texts like this and they rewrite the text to just put in more connections and so on, and the kids' comprehension goes up. That's one way to approach it. Let's avoid the problem. Let's just have the kids deal with the text. But in fact, if you read popular history, if you read, some of these books about Truman or the Addams family, they do this kind of thing of telling a bunch of stories with the idea that you're going to get the argument. And so I actually thought it was better to teach the kids. So I came up with a scheme that I thought would allow them to deal with this chapter. Now, this particular one not only wasn't good that day, but there have been a number of folks who've actually done studies on this. I haven't studied it myself, but there are folks who've done studies on this, finding it to be quite effective, and it's pretty widely used now in high schools, and I've even seen it in colleges, which is kind of weird, given that I came up with it for 5th graders. First, let me show you the chapter, and you're going to see what I mean by incoherence. Again, where are the social studies folks? You'll get a good laugh out of this, I bet. This is literally the whole chapter. The only thing I've taken away besides the graphics, and the graphics in a social studies book are usually quite different than the graphics in a science book. They're really illustrations, they're mood setters. They try to, let me show you a painting that was done in 1860 of, this scene, The history people look at those very unhappy. So I stripped all that away, and the only other thing in here that I don't have is under American Revolution, there was a quote that they'd taken from Thomas Paine, just a one-line kind of thing, and it wasn't part of the content, so I lifted that out. So you're seeing the entire chapter. The first section is the fall of Fort Ticonderoga. The second section is the Battle of Bunker Hill. The third section is the Second Continental Congress. The fourth, Washington takes command. The fifth, the British leave Boston. And then there's a little ending, a good beginning. Now, I love that. Fort Ticonderoga, Bunker Hill, Continental Congress, Washington, Boston. We got the whole thing, right, guys? You see why kids don't know very much when they come to you? We're not kidding around here. So you can see the lack of coherence. So what am I going to do with that? Let me read just a little bit of that. I know it's hard to see from the back, the lighting and stuff, but let me just read a little of this to give you a flavor of the passage itself, and I'll show you what we did. Fall of Fort Ticonderoga. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, the British Army stayed in Boston. The American forces camped around Boston, waiting for the British to move. Meanwhile, a young New Englander named Benedict Arnold had been appointed to lead 400 soldiers at Fort Ticonderoga in New York. After arriving there, he joined forces with Vermont's rough and rugged Ethan Allen. Allen led a group of rebels called the Green Mountain Boys. Before dawn on May 10, 1775, the Americans attacked Fort Ticonderoga. The British were sleeping peacefully. Allen woke up the commander by banging on his door and shouting, "Come out of there, you old rat." The Americans captured the fort without firing a shot. Inside, they found something they needed desperately: heavy iron cannons. That gives you a little bit of the tone of it, the style of it. I showed you all the slides, right? After I used this successfully with the kids, I wanted to share it with teachers. I couldn't afford to do like 27 pages. So I turned it into a typescript. I just typed it up. It's 2 pages. It's 2 pages long. This is what the whole week's reading in social studies was. It's 27 pages in the book, but it's 2 pages of actual reading material. I didn't know that at the time, but okay. So you get what it's like. So what did I ask the kids to do? Now, let me give you the setting. This is a 5th grade suburban classroom. They put 2 classes together, so I had roughly 50 kids in the space that's normally just 25, so we're really tight packed. They're around rectangular tables. We've got 6, 8, there's no social distancing at all in this room. The kids are shoulder to shoulder all the way around the room, and we've got about a dozen teachers along the wall, and there's no place for them to sit, so they're all standing because it's tight. So I pair the kids up. I want them to work together. I pair them up, and I do this extremely scientifically. You and you, you and you. You can't move, right? It's got to be the kids that you're sitting next to that you're going to work with. So it's all 2s and 3s occasionally. What I asked the kids to do, well, the first thing I asked them to do was I wanted them to read the text, and I asked them to read it silently. Hands went up all over the room. Now, they knew I taught at the university. The kids knew this. So they knew I didn't know how to teach anymore. And so they wanted to tell me that I was doing it wrong. Because we read social studies aloud. We do round robin social studies. And the kids know that because that's how they do it. The teacher, would you please read the first paragraph to everybody? And then I'll tell you what it means. And then would you read the second paragraph? And then maybe I'll ask you a question, that kind of thing. And I'm saying, no, I want you to actually read this stuff. I want you guys to read it and try to figure it out. So the kids knew that was crazy. So I had to tell them, today, just humor me. We're actually going to read it. Something that isn't happening. And I gave your elementary folks an earful about that, and I can do the same thing with middle school and high school. I hope I've said enough. These kids really need to do the reading. I've had teachers say to me, no, that doesn't work. They have trouble with that. That's exactly why you teach it. If kids can do something well, they don't need you to teach them that. If they can't do something well, that's where they actually need the teaching. The analogy I've been using, if the kid keeps falling down, you teach him to ride the bicycle. You don't say, well, I can't teach him to ride. He keeps falling. You're going exactly the wrong way. Yes, I get it that if kids try to read it silently, they might not get it. You might have to have them read it again. You might have to have them read it 2 or 3 times. That happened to me. I was doing a demonstration someplace. Had a whole room full of people like this and a classroom of kids. And it was so obvious when I started asking the kids to do something that they hadn't read it. They had just literally, middle school kids just sat there. Going to let me hang out to dry. And the teachers actually came to me later, and the principal came to me later to compliment me because of what I did. I asked the first kid some questions, and I couldn't answer them. I just thought maybe it was the kid because I didn't know these children. I switched to the second kid, and by the time I got to this kid, it was pretty obvious to me. They just had sat there and not read it. And I said, this is terrible. You guys didn't get this at all. You have to read it again. And they kind of went, are you kidding? That never happens. Yeah, you're going to read it again. We're going to keep reading it until you can get it. The teacher's like, we didn't know you could do that. But you can't. You're allowed to. If the kids aren't getting it, you can make them do it twice. It's okay. You're going to have to figure that out online and at a distance now. But, well, Tim, I know that in the classroom. And now you're sitting however far away from the kids you are, seeing them virtually, and it's clear that they haven't done it or they haven't done it well, and you need them to do it again. And you go, well, I don't want to impose on them because it's really hard at what we're doing. And the kids, but you're going to have to ask them to do it again, even in these situations. What I asked them to do with the information that they read, initially very simple stuff that would be pretty generalizable, and frankly, they didn't have much trouble with it. The first thing I wanted them to do was tell what section of text they were reading. So that first one was about the Fort Ticonderoga. Who was it about? Who was that about? Who did they write about? And of course, there was Ethan Allen was there, Benedict Arnold was there, the American troops were there, and so on. What happened? The Americans take over that Fort Ticonderoga. Where did it happen? Fort Ticonderoga, New York. When did it happen? There's a specific date, May 10th, 1775. I can tell you, now remember, this is pairs working. So I don't know. These two are working together. She might be really doing all the work, and this one might be just a free rider. I don't know. But I can tell you on those first 5 questions, who, what, where, when, those first 4 questions, not one of the partnerships had any trouble. Not one of them. So there was at least one kid in every pairing that seemed to be able to do this, and that's pretty good. The one place we hit a little bit of trouble was the why question. Why does it matter? Why is it important? Why is the historian telling you this story? And that one, I literally had to go around and keep explaining to kids what why meant, why we were asking why. They were able to do it, but they needed some of that kind of support. I'm just trying to give you a sense of where you're going to run into trouble and where you won't. So they were able to do that, but they did need some support there. They weren't quite sure what to get at there. And of course, the reason for the why in this case, why is this important? What's the big point of the Fort Ticonderoga story? The cannons. They get the heavy cannons. That's correct. So then what happens? Well, then the next thing they have to do is the same thing with the second part of this. And so now they read about the Battle of Bunker Hill. And again, just very quickly, I want to show you, there's this whole paragraph about the Battle of Bunker Hill. And then there's this paragraph that refers back to Fort Ticonderoga. The British knew they had to attack quickly. If the Americans could drag the cannons taken at Fort Ticonderoga up to the hilltops, they'd be able to pound Boston and the British ships in the harbor. And then you get back, you get to hear about the fight going on Breed's Hill, and you get to find out more about the fight, and don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. This is the long section of the chapter. This is where they keep firing and fighting, and there's multiple attacks. And then finally, again, at the end of this paragraph, you get the cannons captured at Fort Ticonderoga had never left New York. And then you get about how many people died in the battle, and you get here that the Americans were able to fight and beat the British and right up to the end, and so on and so forth. So now the kids have summarized that for me, and they can summarize that very nicely. It's about the Battle of Bunker Hill, the American forces and British forces. The British win the battle. It took place in Boston. It was June 16th. The Americans failed to get the cannons to Boston, is the why. That's why it's an important story. But now the hard part of the thing that really makes them struggle, and that the real learning was taking place. And that's, what's the relationship between the two stories? They've told you one story, they've told you another story, what's the connection? And I can tell you right now, they give the same answer that the high school kids do. It's sequential, right? This one happens first, and then this one happens. And in this case, they're right. One does happen before the other, but in fact, that's not what the relationship is. If you actually look at textbooks, what you'll see is if you guess sequential, you'll be right about 50% of the time. That sometimes the two things are happening simultaneously. Sometimes they're even telling you something that happened later before they tell you something that happened earlier. But the kids figure it's all just sequence, And therefore, we're just following the sequence. And so this battle happened, and then that battle, no wonder it's boring. There's no argument, there's nothing going on here, there's nothing dynamic. So they have to figure out what's the relationship between those two stories. And you put the finger on it that the relationship has to do with cannons. Gee, the Americans in New York capture cannons. In the second section, they lose the Battle of Bunker Hill because they don't have cannons. But they had, what's going on here? And then we get to the third part of the story, a new story, and the new story is about the Congress. This is the one section where the boys and girls needed some information that wasn't in the text. We always talk about they don't have the background knowledge. These kids were lacking a piece of background knowledge. They didn't know what a Congress did. Okay, if you've been watching the news recently, you probably feel the same way, but you get what I'm telling you. So we had to explain that it was the Congress that would do things like appoint the leaders of the military or raise the taxes to get armaments or whatever, because they didn't know that. That just wasn't in the book. What happens here is they make George Washington the head of all the armies. They do something that hasn't happened up to this point, because Massachusetts had an army, New York had an army, everybody had an army, and they were all fighting the British. But now George Washington is going to head up all those armies. What does Washington do now that he's the head of the army? You know those cannons that belong to the New York militia? He can move them any place he wants to. And he moves them to Boston and kicks the British out of Boston. The main point of the whole thing is the American army has to be unified if they're going to win. They have to be able to coordinate all the actions or they can't win. There's a whole historical idea here. The teachers who had been teaching this textbook for 3 or 4 years told me it was the first time they ever understood the chapter. We looked in the teacher's guide, there was no explanation of this at all. I once was doing a workshop and the publisher of the publishing company that issued this book had lunch with her, and we were talking about it, and her staff said, "That's our book." Oops. They were so embarrassed. But this is very common, and the kids don't know what to do with it. What these kids were doing by going through the set of steps that I'm talking about is they were turning a story into an argument. And the kids, these 10 and 11-year-old kids, were the ones explaining it to the teachers. They even found mistakes that the teachers were making in their reading. And we're correcting them because they didn't fit the theory. When we got done, the kids filed out. The teachers all grouped around. The first person to speak was a male teacher. I don't remember if he taught 4th or 5th grade, but he said, "We don't have this kind of time to do what you're talking about." I had spent an entire hour on this. This was a full 60 minutes. He said, "We don't have that kind of time in social studies, and frankly, social studies isn't just about reading. We want to do things like make lye soap and things like that really teach history." And I was going to give the college academic kind of answer, tell them about the kinds of stuff we've been talking about today. Before I could say anything, the teacher whose classroom we were using said, "What do you mean? He taught the entire week of social studies. The reason why there are 5 big sections there, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, these 2 pages were to be read over a 5-day period. I had taught an entire week social studies in 1 lesson. And she said, we have the other 4 days if we want to make lye soap." The kids were excited. The kids thought this was really interesting. They were actually getting something out of this. The fact is, as I say, this has been studied now in high schools and colleges, and the research is quite positive in what it teaches. And so this idea of not getting rid of the textbook, but actually teaching kids how to do the reasoning that allows you to understand this kind of text in history should be happening. And this, as you'll see, is very consistent with your standards. It's not some extra thing. I promised you earlier I would show you some of the work out of functional linguistics. Let me turn to that now. Functional linguists are showing how texts differ across disciplines, but secondary teachers are increasingly trying to teach content without text. Math teachers have done this forever. If you visit, well, William Schmidt, Michigan State University, has done worldwide studies of this, and what he has found is math teaching is the most consistent teaching that we have. That you'll find very similar lessons from one district to another and one state to another and so on. Something like 86% of the math teachers teach in generally the same way, according to Schmidt. Schmidt has essentially described textbooks in math as a source of problems. The math teacher explains the content, the method, whatever it is, I'll take you through this theorem, and we'll do maybe some worked problems together. But then what we're going to do with the textbook is I'm going to have you do items, blip, 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 and blip, and you can start those now, and if you don't finish them, take them home for homework, and we'll look at them tomorrow, blah, 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 and you start the whole process again. Very common. So that when I interview middle school and high school kids, they tell me that they don't read the math book. They're not supposed to read the math book. The teacher last year didn't have them read the math book, that kind of thing. And when I have them read the math book, they're startled that they can actually understand some of it. The science teachers often fall into this, maybe not quite as much as the math teachers, but the science teachers often do it because their texts are so demanding that they're not quite sure what they could do to support it, so they kind of pull away from it. And for years, I used to say, well, you'll do that in science and math, but you won't ever see that in English. I'm seeing that in English classes now. I'm literally seeing English classes where they're telling the kids that they don't have to read Shakespeare or whatever. The teacher will tell you what the story is, and you'll go from there. Or we can watch a video. That'll fix it. Now you'll know the story, and you don't have to read it. We are making a huge mistake, and these folks are coming up really with some insights that I think can help you to guide kids to make sense of some of these texts that are honestly hard for them. I'm not arguing that. And so I've got a couple of examples here. And the first one is history. And I'm swiping these from a book by Fang and Shepard-Grill. Shepard-Grill is a linguist at the University of Michigan, and the book was published by the University of Michigan Press. At the end of this presentation, I have some resources, and that's one of the things on the list. It's there for a good reason. They've come up with some very good practical things. Essentially what they say, again, remember, they're analyzing the language in the text. They say history text constructs time and causation. Time and causation. History constructs, history constructs actors and the processes they engage in to move towards their goals. In other words, they try to attribute agency. Very different than what science people do. Science people are interested in causation. It isn't because they don't like each other. The reason why trees grow apples isn't because birds like apples, and they know that, and they figured maybe birds will broadcast their seeds, and so they're going to grow sweet apples for them. That's not how it happens, right? It's a different kind of process. There's no intentionality in it. There's no intentional action in science. But in history, there is, and so attributing agency is really central to the language. They try to present judgments and interpretations, arguments, and they try to do that often from narratives that have a lack of a clear set of connections to the thesis, and we just looked at that. And so they suggest some teaching tools like this, and I actually like this very much. And I've swiped this right out of the book. I haven't filtered this in any way. Essentially what they're suggesting is that when kids are reading history, literally having them go through and try to diagram the sentences or break down what these sentences are doing is a good idea. And so, for example, in this text, over the next decade, further events steadily led to war. And what the kids have done is they're putting it into this chart of circumstance, actor, process, goal, circumstance. A circumstance, in their terminology, is a place or a time or some kind of a condition. And so over the next decade is a circumstance. And the actors, those are going to tend to be the subjects, are the further events, a non-human subject. There are actors like Sam Adams and the other colonial leaders, they, the same people, George III and his ministers, and they engage in certain actions. These events lead to these things. These leaders favor something. They encourage something. George III and his folks make something. And they're all aimed at goals. Well, the non-human actors don't have goals. They can't have a goal. They can only have circumstances. So over the next decade, further events steadily led to another circumstance, war. Some colonial leaders, such as Sam Adams, favored their goal, independence from Britain. These colonial leaders, they want conflict with the British authorities. If they can get that going, they can disrupt things. At the same time, a circumstance, George III and his ministers made enemies. He wants to be enemies with these moderate colonists, and they do it through their harsh stance. And essentially what they're doing is saying, you've got to get these kids, when they're reading this kind of material, trying to figure out what is it that these people want? Why are they taking the actions that they're taking? It's not enough that you know what they did. You have to understand that they're doing these for a purpose. They're human beings. It's goal-directed. It's very different than what you'd see in a chemistry class. It's goal-directed. And so they would actually have you analyzing that. And if you work with that kind of thing, you find that really helps the kids. That really shifts their thinking in a nice way. Let me show a little bit out of the science part of what they do. They say science text is technical, abstract, dense, tightly knit language that contrasts with the more interactive or interpersonal styles of other kinds of text or other kinds of language. Science is a very noun-oriented language. A very high percentage of the words that you're going to see in a science book are going to be nouns. In fact, I think it's like 60% of the words are nouns. Sometimes they're used as nouns, they're used as subjects, sometimes they're used as adjectives, sometimes they're used as verbs, sometimes they're used as adverbs. And so you could literally pick up a science book and read a sentence that will have 3 or 4 or 5 or even 6 nouns right in a row. You don't usually find that in regular text. You don't find that in colloquial language. You'll find passive voice. You know, the atoms were excited by the heat instead of the heat excited the atoms. The English teachers are going, heat. The atoms were excited by the heat. I don't like that. But there's a purpose to it. And the purpose is, I've got to suppress agency. Remember, agency is something for the history teacher. People are doing things intentionally. In this case, the heat isn't trying to get the atoms to do anything. It's just a condition. When there's heat, the atoms are going to do something. And so passive voice allows you to stress, nobody's leading this, it's just happening. That's important. That's not a minor little thing. They try to suppress agency. Readers need to focus on causation, not intention. We often talk about sentences being complex because they have a lot of clauses. You know, we stitch together a bunch of ideas. I might have some examples of that in a few slides. I don't remember if I do or not. But in science, you tend not to find many clauses. It's usually a single clause sentence in most cases with lots of phrases. The adjective is drawn out of science. They don't use many adjectives. They use things like prepositional phrases to modify a noun. You'll see, oh good, here's one. Here's a good example of a science sentence, of noun-centric prose. And I've underlined the subject. This is quite typical. Experimental verification of Einstein's explanation of the photoelectric effect was made 11 years later by the American physicist Robert Millikan. Every aspect of Einstein's interpretation was confirmed. You never just get Einstein did this or the atom did that. It's this very long explanation of what that noun is, what that subject is. I shared one yesterday with the elementary teachers out of a 5th grade book, and it was 25, the sentence was 25 words long, and the verb was the 23rd word in the sentence. When we talk to each other in English, we tend to put the verb right up near the head of the sentence. Why do we do that? Because what linguists tell us is we interpret sentences, or what they refer to as propositions. They interpret them from the verb out. So you listen or read for the verb. You do this tacitly. You don't do this intentionally. You're reading, and they've been able to show you're looking for the verb. Once you find the verb, you start connecting the ideas. And so, if you find, oh, was made, okay, what was made? What did they make? When did they make? Who did they make that for? That kind of thing. Do we have any German speakers in the room or German readers? I can make anything up if there isn't. Great. I'm told, I don't speak German, but I'm told in German there are certain constructions where always the last word in the sentence is going to be the verb. So you have to hold everything in memory until you get that verb, and then you can start to interpret the sentence. It makes German really hard. English is actually becoming more like German in this regard. And science is actually leading this. The language has been changing in this regard over about a 150-year period, but actually mostly over the last 50 years. And what we're seeing is the verbs are migrating further to the right in sentences. Science text is doing this more than anything else. Other informational texts are following it, and they're even now finding it in literature. The verbs are getting deeper and deeper in the sentence, and nobody's showing kids what to do with this stuff. And so you go, wow, even the grammar is different. This notion of using nouns as modifiers of nouns used to, 200 years ago, there were rules in the English language. The only places you would ever find two nouns in a row like that were either with people's titles like king or doctor, or with certain place names like Hampton Court or Dumbarton Castle, that kind of, Swartz Creek, that kind of thing. And then that started to change, and it's changed very slowly, but in the last 50 years, it's become a kind of, we can put any noun with any other noun and make it mean anything we want to. And so, it starts to be sandbank and flannel rollers and family history and cancer cells and quarantine restrictions and that kind of thing. But now you'll see things like filet, comet, lander, alien cover-up conspiracy theories emerge. 6 nouns in a row. Good luck. I couldn't figure it out. Have fun. If you want to see how the language becomes scientized and what it is that kids are grappling with and what they could use some help with, is this that I've swiped from the late Michael Halliday. Michael was really the person who came up with this functional linguistics idea and started studying science text with it. And you could use this as either an illustration of what it is that kids have to learn across their school years, or of how science language has changed over the last several hundred years. So you start out here with glass cracks more quickly the harder you press on it. And frankly, even a kindergartner can usually understand what that means. Gee, if I press hard on this, the glass is going to break faster, right? Pretty simple stuff. There's, somebody's doing something, there's an action, there's an outcome. Pretty easy. But look what starts to happen. We go from this glass cracking, this action, to cracks in glass grow faster the more pressure is put on. Uh-oh. It's not an action anymore, it's a thing. It's the cracks in the glass we're going to look at. And the cracks in the glass, taking an action and turning it into a thing, allows us as a scientist, we can freeze it, we can really look at it, we can study it. Can't study the movement so much, but I can study the thing. I can study these cracks. So cracks in glass grow faster the more pressure is put on. And the harder you press on it, the more pressure. Those are close, but you can see it's getting a little abstract. But look what happens here. Glass crack growth. Ooh, now it's not just a thing, it's a measurable thing. Is faster if greater stress is applied. Wow, this is getting abstract and becoming a thing over here too. We can study the stress thing. And then the rate of glass crack growth, now it's definitely a measure of a thing, depends on the magnitude of the applied stress. I now have two things and a relationship among two things. We've just got the correlation. And finally, glass crack growth rate is associated with applied stress magnitude, which is probably what we're seeing in your textbooks. And the kids are going, this I understand. I don't get what's going on here. Understanding that the language of science is going to try to turn actions into things that we can look at and try to turn those actions into something measurable that we can study is hugely important. And yet, this nominalization takes place in all your subjects, more in science than any place else. I want to show you one more thing before we start pulling this together. I talked a lot earlier about those graphic elements. I at least want to illustrate something to you here. I told you that because language is inadequate, it's critical in the sciences and frankly in a lot of your technical fields, not just science. In any of your technical fields, you find that you need multimodal illustrations and photographs and charts and tables and graphics. And so one of the things that when you look at a science book, there are going to be large numbers of tables and charts and graphics, three-dimensional representations, scientific drawings, flowcharts, photographs, and goes on and on. I'm not trying to show you all of them, but I am going to suggest some things that could be taught to kids in any of these technical subjects to help them understand these. First, let's just start with some. Here are some illustrations you might find in science books. I wonder how many of you know what those 4 pictures are. What the differences are. Science people, what are they? That's water. Everybody knows that's water. But which one is water? Yeah, absolutely, all of them. But they look so different. But they're all showing some of the same things, aren't they? The critical things. You can see, the Mickey Mouse one. Look, there's the oxygen, and there are the 2 hydrogens. H2. Oh, I get it. Oh, wait, look at that one. H2O2. Hey, look. Oh, that's a more complicated picture. That's a different structure of water. That shows more than one molecule, doesn't it? Oh, well. If you think you're so smart with the H2, how are you with this one? I don't expect you to get it off the top of your head. What is it? I love you. It's sugar. All 4 of them are sugar. That was easier than I hoped. Good. Well, let's take a look at, just again, quickly, I want to suggest to you that there are particular kinds of graphics, and the kids don't know what to do with these. I see it at the university with graduate students when I try to show them a regression equation or some kind of a table or chart. And these brilliant men and women, teachers usually, don't know how to read these things because nobody's ever shown, including from places like Harvard. So we got some work to do, guys. And so one of the kinds of graphics are spatial graphics. They try to represent the spatial placement of objects or the physical relationship among objects or parts. And yes, you will see these not just in science. You can see spatial graphics. A map in history, in a geography class, is a spatial graphic. That's all a map really is. An understanding of spatial graphics is demonstrated by being able to describe or remember the relative placements of the items in the graphics, what their relationships are to each other. It's not enough to remember the actual items, you have to understand their relationship. A second kind of graphic are sequential graphics. They represent steps in a process or a cycle, like a flow chart. Understanding of sequential graphics require readers to be able to describe the steps in a process in an appropriate sequence. Key features of the process, such as asymmetricity, circularity, and so on. A third kind of graphic, comparative graphics. These graphics reveal similarities and differences in phenomena or processes, include scientific drawings, tables, bar graphs. Understanding a comparative graphic requires that readers recognize what's being compared and be able to draw appropriate generalizations from the comparisons. A fourth one, classification or hierarchical graphics. These reveal taxonomic or rank relationships or arrangements among phenomena, objects, processes, including tree diagrams and category graphs and all that kind of thing. Understanding these requires recognizing what's being compared, whether the nature of the relations being pictured, is it superior to inferior, general to specific, that kind of thing. And finally, causal graphics reveal what conditions or actions lead to particular outcomes. Can take many forms, but be especially careful of graphics that illustrate relationships between two variables that are not necessarily causal. Understanding requires being able to describe the antecedent and the consequent and how the former impacts the latter. So we got these 5 kinds of graphics: spatial, sequential, comparative, classification, and causal. And I would suggest actually teaching this to kids. And so, for example, I hope you can see this one. It's a really pretty one, but is this spatial or sequential or comparative? Do you know what it is, first of all? Anyone recognize it? Milky Way. So this shows you the Milky Way. And so what kind of a graphic do you think this is? Spatial, yeah. It shows you how it's lighter in the middle and all that kind of stuff. You can see how it spreads out and so on. How about this one? Is this spatial or sequential or comparative? It's sequential. This is a flow chart. So it shows you, how the water process works, and the evaporation and all that kind of thing, precipitation. This one is the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. So you can see the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and you can see the years that they're showing that. What is this one? Compared. What are they comparing? You're seeing that CO2 in different years, right? So you can see that it's getting higher, right? That's one of my favorites. This is actually a couple of different things, but let's just see if we can get any of them. It's certainly classificatory, right? You're trying to get these simians into the right groups, but they're doing 2 things there, aren't they? They've got these, this one's classificatory, so is this one, but they're comparing the 2. Here's the old classification scheme, here's our new classification scheme. So this is a tricky one, because the kids have to actually recognize the 2 things that are going on there. What is this? This is a weather map, right? Heat map. And so we can go on with this, but you get the idea. These are kind of fun. This is one of my favorite ones. Here's a solid, here's liquid, here's gas. And it's just, which is it? Is this causal or is this comparative? What are they showing here? The state of matter with a definite shape and volume is a solid. The molecules of a solid or a crystal are very close. Liquid, the state of matter with a definite volume but not a definite shape. Molecules of a liquid are free-flowing. Yeah, it's comparative for sure. And then if you go to this one, it's going to show you the same thing, but it's going to make it much more causal. That as you're adding heat to it, it's changing it. The point is, how can kids make sense of that if nobody shows them how to do it? They need to start to be able to recognize things. So let me end this little section before we get into that next slide. Let me do this. Let me tell you, I told you some stories about those Montana experiences. Let me tell you one last one. I was teaching a high school anatomy class, and I'd been asked to teach the section on meninges. And I'm sure you all know what meninges are, so I don't need to explain that to you. It's about 6 pages, much of which was graphics. And I took it home and I looked at it, and what my job was to try to figure out a lesson that would force the students to connect the prose with the graphics, right? So they wouldn't just look at this visual, they would maybe look at this visual but also read a paragraph about it, or that kind of thing. And because there were several graphics and several paragraphs, there was going to be a lot of this kind of connecting. So I did say, if you go in the literature, nobody's written about how to teach this. Everyone agrees you need to know how to do this, but there's nothing out there. So I made something up. And what I made up was, first of all, I went through the prose part of the passage, And I literally took every sentence and I either just typed it onto a piece of paper, either just repeated the sentence if it was really quick and coherent and efficient, and if it wasn't, I tried to paraphrase it as exactly as I could so that I could just get a representation of each of the ideas in the text. And I did that for a whole page, so I must have, and I double spaced, so it must have been like 26 lines of that. And then I quit because I got tired. I was about halfway through the pages. I brought that to school the next day, and there were a bunch of kids, there were 18 kids in the class. I handed these out to the youngsters, and they'd already read it once for homework. I asked them, I said, I've got this, I've tried to summarize these as accurately as I can, I've only done the first half. But what I want you to do is read each one of these sentences, and your job is to check against the graphics and see which graphics give you the same information. So if it tells you that the meninges are near the spinal cord, then you got to find in a graphic that it shows that the meninges is near a spinal, that kind of thing, right? And so I told the kids they could work with partners. Nobody chose to work with a partner. Every kid did this on his own. Just like, I don't know why, they just did it. They worked it, they got that done fairly quickly. So I said, okay, I want you to do that with the rest of the passage. Here's where I left off, just finish it up. You just do it with each of the other sentences. They did that. The teacher got them into a discussion about it. The kids had learned what they needed to learn. They were understanding what they were needed to understand. So we had a moment to do a very unscientific experiment. And I literally, in the last couple of minutes of class, I literally went from kid to kid. Is this normally how you read? I mean, really, I told you, very scientific, very rigorous. And the kids, 14 of the kids said, no, this isn't how I normally read. The way I normally read is I skip all those pictures and things. I can do it faster if I just read the text. So when she asks me to read this for homework, I just read this part, and you made me go in and actually look at those and connect them up, and that was really different for me. 3 of the kids said, I'm not a very good reader. And they said this with all the kids sitting around. I mean, I was really kind of shocked at how open these kids were. They said, I'm not a very good reader. And so when she assigns this, I usually don't read the text. I only look at the pictures to figure out as much as I can from it. And I see nods from you. I didn't know that one before. I had to come across that one in my own. And the one kid out of the 18 said, yeah, that's pretty much how I do it. I go back and forth. And it turned out that kid had a science background. His mom was a pharmacist or something. And he said he didn't learn it at school. So this teacher, and I told you she was a scientist, she was stunned. She had no idea that these kids weren't trying to connect these pieces of graphics. And said, the kids said, she asked me, did you like this? They said, yeah, they'd like to do more of that. She said, we definitely have to do more of that, not just because they liked it, but because it was, because it was getting these kids to actually do something that they needed to do. They were actually doing something that they needed to do. And so this idea of teaching kids what these graphics are doing to get them to, I can see even testing kids on that. Can you recognize what kind of graphic that is? Can you put it in the right classification? Can you tell me what it means? Can you explain it? Can you connect it with the right paragraph? Does the book say something different about it, in the sentences and stuff like that? I think that has a place. What I've done here, folks, is I have just lifted some of the standards, grades 6 through 12. I don't have them in any kind of wonderful order. I just want to illustrate what the state has essentially committed you to. These are in science and technical subjects. What's a technical subject? Well, I bet some of the computer stuff and that kind of tech stuff maybe done in a business department, I would argue, is technical. I was talking to somebody who teaches pottery today. Some of the things that you guys do with glazes and stuff is pretty technical. It's more like what we do in chemistry than it is like what we do in an art class, perhaps, in a humanities focused class. So it could be a lot of different things, but let's look at what you're being asked to teach. And so, for example, determine the meaning of symbols, key terms, and other domain-specific words and phrases as they're used in a specific scientific or technical text. Boy, oh boy, when I'm in a math class and try to get kids to read algebra, so often I find that kids actually don't know the names of the symbols, or don't know the grammar, don't know the order of reading an algebraic sentence. And I see nods, so I'm not the only one who's seeing this, right? This is real. We talked about teaching fluency in a reading program. Learning to read math fluently, where you actually know all the symbols and so on, is really essential. That's not a little thing. Got to be there. Those chemists that we studied, one of them, oops, that was me, yes. One of them told us about when he's reading something that's important for him to read, the first thing he does is he goes in and finds all the variables. So, you know, in this article, A is going to stand for and B is going to stand. He goes and finds those and writes them down and learns them. He memorizes those so that when he's reading, he won't be futzing around trying to figure out, well, what does he mean by A or what does he mean by B? That's, my goodness, that's a little different than how I would normally read that, say, in an English class. Integrate quantitative or technical information expressed in words in a text with a version of that information expressed visually. We were just talking about that one. Distinguish among facts, reasoned judgment based on research findings, and speculation in the text. Man, I wish you guys would have done a better job on this one, given what's going on in our public lives these days. Wouldn't it be terrific if everybody in the community was making those distinctions? Analyze the structure of the relationships among concepts in a text, including relationships among key terms like force and friction, reaction force, energy. Translate quantitative or technical information expressed in words in the text into visual form, and translate information expressed visually or mathematically into words. Not enough of that. Compare and contrast findings presented in the text to those from other sources, including their own experiments, noting when the findings support or contradict previous explanations or accounts. But this one I love. I might have written this one, so I'm not sure that the reason I love it is because it's mine. Cite specific textual evidence to support analysis of science and technical text, attending to important distinctions the author makes and to any gaps or inconsistencies in the account. Many years ago, I was working, I won't tell you the school district, but it was here in Michigan, and it was an elementary, it wasn't secondary, so you guys didn't do it. I was observing a science lesson, and this was the seeds unit. You know the seeds unit with the vermiculite and the cups and the kids putting the seeds in. And this was really an experiment. And you know, it came right out of the textbook that was probably written in California or someplace like that. But essentially what they were supposed to do is the kids would all make their little cup with the seeds and all that stuff. And then you put half of them out on the windowsill where you get all that warm sun. And you know what happened? There's a difference between photosynthesis and that Michigan story. Because if we don't start teaching kids that, they don't understand science. If you look at that list, folks, is there anything on that list that you really believe the reading teacher or the English teacher could teach better than you could? Would understand better than you understand? Would deal with in their own reading as often as you deal with it? I'm not asking you to do something crazy. I'm asking you to do the stuff that you're the only person I can depend on to do this for our boys and girls. And look at this one, out of history and social studies and those kinds of subjects. Cite specific textual evidence to support analysis of primary and secondary sources, attending to such features as the date and origin of the information. And man, if that shouldn't bring a tear to the eye of any history teacher. That's quite wonderful. Analyze in detail a series of events described in a text and the causes that link the events. Distinguish whether earlier events caused later ones or simply preceded them. Heck, I even gave you some tools for working on that one. Identify aspects of a text that reveal an author's point of view or purpose, loaded language, inclusion or avoidance of particular facts. Interpret the meaning of words and phrases in a text, including how an author uses and refines the meaning of a key term over the course of a text. And the example is Federalist number 10. This is the one where Madison starts out saying that factions undermine a society. And by the end of the essay, he's explaining that, in fact, having these factions counterweighting against each other is what allows a democratic society to actually work. And so faction, this bad thing, becomes faction, this necessary good thing. Kind of a cool idea. Evaluate the author's differing points of view on the same historical event or issue by assessing the author's claims, evidence, and reasoning. Compare and contrast treatments of the same topic in several primary and secondary sources. I'm going to ask the exact same question that I asked the science and technical folks. Do you really believe, social studies teachers, that there's anybody who would be more well situated to teach these kinds of things than you? It would just defy all explanation if you were to answer that anyway, but no, that's our stuff. That we can do that. We should do that. And here is literature. And again, literature isn't posed in the state as disciplinary literacy, and yet we're going to see how unique and special it is. Determine two or more themes of a text and analyze the development over the course of the text, including how they interact and build on one another to produce a complex account. Oh my goodness, I even taught you some ways of doing such things. Analyze the impact of the author's choices regarding how to develop and relate elements of a story or drama, such as where a story is set or how the action is ordered. Determine the meaning of words and phrases. Boy, that sounds like what we saw in science as they're used in the text, including figurative and connotative. No, we're going to get into some really different things here. Figurative and connotative language. Analyze the impacts of specific word choices on meaning and tone, including words with multiple meanings or language that's particularly fresh, engaging, or beautiful. In other words, let's get into aesthetic issues in language, something that none of the rest of you are going to deal with. Analyze how an author's choices concerning how to structure specific parts of a text, such as the choice of where to begin or end a story, contribute to its overall structure and meaning, as well as its aesthetic impact, and so on from there. And I would say, English teachers, I know a lot of times people say, you guys should be teaching reading. You should be teaching disciplinary literacy. You should be teaching kids how to read and interpret literature. That's your strong spot. That's where you make the biggest contribution at these grade levels. We need you to do that well. I told you that I had some references and resources in here. The one that's maybe most useful to everybody is this Fang and Shepard-Rell piece, Reading in Secondary Content Areas. I don't know how expensive it is because I bought my copy years ago. There's a chapter on not only the 4 disciplines, but several other specializations. Each one, just the way I took you through, so here's what the history people do, here's what the science people do, and showing the kinds of instruction that they think is good. I don't know if this is on the professional development collection in the district, but if it isn't, maybe it could be added, and certainly some of you might just want to have a copy around. I keep one on my desk because I get these questions, and being able to turn into there, really practically helpful. These other ones are good too. How to Read Literature Like a Professor. That was actually a bestseller. That's a wonderful book. They tell me there's a middle school version of it. I've also heard it's not very good. What do you think of it? It's almost the same, so you're better off with this one. Yeah, okay. That's what I haven't looked at that one, but I'm told that. This is about teaching these things. This is about teaching these things. This is actually on my website, Teaching Disciplinary Literacy to Adolescents, if you want an article about that, and so on down the list. Oh, a book by Sam Weinberg and his colleagues on how to read like a historian. I also have some online disciplinary literacy resources for you. There's many more of these right now for history and social studies than they are for the other subjects. The reason for that is, frankly, I think because of Sam Weinberg. He got into this earlier than most other people did, and so that field's ahead of the rest of us. And so they've got a lot more stuff developed. One of my favorite pieces is this one, the historical scene investigation. Anybody ever watch CSI on television? You know what I'm talking about? What is that, crime scene investigation? This is a compendium of text sets that have been assembled either by groups of teachers or teachers and professors. And they're both in world culture and in American history, though there's a bit more in American history. I've used it to do like upper elementary and middle school American history teaching. The unit I used was on the Boston Massacre. And the folks who put it together have paintings of the event. They have testimony that was given at the trial. They have, historical writings about it. And what the kids have to do is they have to work through these text sets to solve do exactly what they do on TV. Can you solve the crime? Can you figure out what happened? And they're kind of cool. I don't think you can add any new units to it, but all these units are still there. There's really good stuff for you. Improving literacy in secondary school. I don't even remember what that is. It's got to be good or I wouldn't have it on the list. Reading in the disciplines. These are a lot of publications for teachers. This one, I was just making this presentation in another part of the country, and when I put this slide up, one of the history teachers said, what you have to have on there is the Stanford History Education Group, and it's on there, guys. And they have all the stuff that Sam and his colleagues have put together. The teaching channel has wonderful videos of high school and middle school teaching of reading like a historian. The state of Wisconsin has some wonderful stuff in all the different subjects. Covered a lot of ground here. Remember, these are all online for you, so you don't have to worry about, how will we see those if we want them? They're up there, they're on my site. Also on my site, there's a resource section, and there's a whole section that's just on disciplinary literacy, if you wanted to go into those sites. And those are, for the most part, they're not commercial sites. They just got really good free stuff for teachers. You don't have to be a member or own something or pay something. I think I'm going to end this pretty much like we started today. But let's do it this way. First of all, let me ask you a question. I'm interested in seeing we'll do a little poll. Let's just see a show of hands. I was talking to a teacher here in Michigan a couple of months ago, and she a middle school teacher, a reading teacher, and she was telling me, she said when school shut down in March, she felt that she knew her kids really well at that point. She said that the boys and girls that, normally in a discussion, there's some kids who are really pretty voluble, so she knew who she could call on that would get things going and kind of pull the other kids in and so on. And she said when she tried to do that kind of thing online, what she found is even those kids were much more inhibited than they usually were. And I see some nods. I've asked a lot of teachers around the country in the last few months after she told me that, because I went and looked up, I wanted to see if there was a literature on that, and there isn't. So I was curious, maybe it was just her experience, and I'm hearing it from a lot of teachers. Even the kids who are usually very participatory, no, yes, they give just terse answers and kind of, you're not quite sure what to do. And so what I've been suggesting is a lot more polling of kids, a lot more questioning, asking them. So I'm going to do my own little poll. I don't have to have you type it into the question and answers box here, but I can just sort of ask. I'm curious how many of you have a different idea about what disciplinary literacy is than when you came in this morning? Just show of hands. Oh, that's very nice. That feels good. How many of you feel more responsible for dealing with this kind of thing than you did when you came in? That's pretty cool too. Good. I think the folks who invited me are probably happy about that. I hope they are. I hope you find a way. I know this is going to be a tough ride for you and the boys and girls you're responsible for, and I wish I could fix it for you somehow. I love you guys, but I just, I know it's going to be hard, and you're going to have to really kind of buck each other up. You're going to do this together. You're not going to do this alone. When we're doing this, what we need to teach the boys and girls and what it takes to learn these things doesn't change. The circumstance changes. We're going to have to get used to that. We're going to have to figure some of that out. Instead of just doing a lesson and watching kids' eyes, and now it's going to be, well, every 15 minutes I do a poll, and I have a question built in so that I can find out what they're thinking. And Tommy, you haven't answered yet, that kind of thing. I think you're going to have to do things like that. And I don't know what the system is in the district. We've got to find ways of sharing that with each other so that you get smart fast. I've not talked about that part of this. And the reason I'm an expert, the reason why people invite me in, two reasons. I know the research usually as well as about anybody, and two, I've got 50 years of experience at all different kinds of roles and so on. This is one I don't have experience with, and there isn't a bunch of research to go on. And so I don't know any more about it than you do. We have to help each other. What I do know is the content of what we need to teach, and I do know how to teach. And I hope I have given you something in those two areas. And with that, I'm going to say this. Folks, certainly thank you for being here today, but more importantly, thank you for being here every day. Your work matters. Thank you so much. And with that, you may go to wherever you want to. Good luck to you.
It really does. I know why you're getting it. That's why.